There is a place in Northern California where the ocean fogs roll in thick, enough to swallow sound, where the coastline turns jagged, and the trees thin out and the land feels like it is holding its breath. Pelican Bay State Prison sits at the edge of that silence, built to contain the unconfinable, designed to isolate the irreducible. It became something more than a prison. It became a system with its own weather, its own gravity, its own internal logic that few outsiders ever fully understood. And inside that system, there was one place even the guards feared to enter alone. Before we go further, if documentaries like this one matter to you, consider subscribing and sharing this with someone who needs to hear this story. Every view keeps investigations like this alive. The correctional officers who worked Pelican Bay in its early decades describe the facility the way soldiers describe a combat zone, not with drama, with exhaustion. With the particular flatness of a voice that has already processed what it is about to say. One former sergeant, who spent nearly 15 years inside those walls, paused before almost every answer, not because he was hiding something, because he was measuring it. "You don't talk about that place casually," he said. "It stays with you in a way that's hard to explain to someone who hasn't been there." Pelican Bay opened in 1989. Carved out of Del Norte County, one of the most remote and economically isolated regions in the state. The choice of location was deliberate. Distance was part of the architecture. Distance from families. Distance from lawyers. Distance from public attention. The facility was designed with a specific philosophy. Total control through total separation. Its security housing unit, the SHU, became the most discussed and debated corner of the American prison system. But inside the general maximum security housing, there were blocks that existed in a different category entirely. Blocks that did not appear prominently in policy documents. Blocks that veteran staff simply called the unit. Officers described the approach to that corridor the way you might describe approaching a shoreline in a storm. You could feel it before you arrived. A change in the air, a shift in sound, the particular silence that precedes something loud. The fluorescent lights in that section hummed at a slightly different pitch than the rest of the facility. At least, that is how multiple officers remembered it. Whether that was real or simply the mind constructing an atmosphere to match its dread is impossible to say now, but the dread itself was consistent. Across years, across different officers, across different administrations, a laminated roster kept by some officers carried a stenciled phrase that became a kind of dark institutional shorthand. It was half warning, half admission of something the system preferred not to say aloud. That phrase and what it revealed about the culture inside is where this story begins. Because when the guards themselves circulate warnings about a place, it means the institution has already acknowledged, in its own way, that something has gone wrong. The question this documentary asks is simple: how wrong? And who knew? What the records show, what the testimonies suggest, and what the silence around certain incident reports implies, all of that points toward a unit that operated at the edge of what any institution should sustain. Officers entered in pairs when policy allowed. When it did not, they entered alone and hoped. Training prepared them for procedure. It did not fully prepare them for this, and the men inside those cells, carrying their own histories, their own fears, their own institutional damage, lived inside that same unresolvable tension. This is the story of what happens when a system pushes human beings, on both sides of the door, to the absolute limit of endurance. It begins in a corridor that nobody wanted to walk, and it does not end cleanly. There is a particular kind of knowledge that only comes from repetition, from walking the same corridor so many times that your body learns it before your mind does, from knowing, without looking, exactly where the blind corners are. Pelican Bay's most feared housing unit was not dangerous in the way that word is used casually. It was dangerous the way a structural fault is dangerous, invisibly, systematically, and with impatience that outlasted any individual incident. The physical design of the unit was, in many ways, its first weapon. Long sightlines that seemed to offer visibility but delivered false confidence. Blind corners that appeared suddenly, swallowing whatever came around them. Heavy steel doors that, once closed, separated an officer from backup in seconds. Choke points, places where the corridor narrowed, where a body could be pressed, where movement became constrained. Architects design prisons to contain inmates. They do not always design them to protect the people working inside. Officers who rotated through that unit in its most volatile years described the layout with a kind of cartographic precision. They had memorized it the way people memorize exit routes in buildings they distrust. You knew where you could stand so that two doors were always in your peripheral, one former officer explained. You knew which panel took longer to respond. You knew which stretch of hallway was the longest sprint back to a secure position. That knowledge was not in any training manual. It was passed down, officer to officer, like folklore. Like survival literature transmitted through shift handovers and cigarette breaks outside the facility perimeter. The inmate population inside that unit was not random. By institutional design, Pelican Bay concentrated its highest-risk individuals in its most controlled spaces. Men with histories of orchestrating violence. Men whose influence did not diminish behind a locked door. Men who had, in some documented cases, directed events outside the facility from inside a 6x11 cell. The convergence of those individuals in one physical space created something that correctional theory had a name for but struggled to manage. Culture of tactical pressure, not constant eruption. Something more disciplined than that. A sustained, low-frequency testing of boundaries that wore down staff the way water wears down stone. Officers described it as a kind of surveillance inversion. They were supposed to be watching the inmates. But inside that unit, they always felt watched first. You learn that some of them are reading you before you've even registered them, a former staff member recalled. They're tracking your schedule, noting when you deviate, registering what makes you hesitate. It was a form of intelligence gathering conducted through observation alone. From behind cell doors, through food slots, across recreation yards during limited movement windows. And it was effective. Officers who fell into predictable patterns were tested. Those who deviated were tested differently. There was no neutral behavior inside that corridor. The contraband economy inside the unit added another layer of complexity. Shanks fashioned from materials so ordinary they should not have been dangerous. Communication systems developed from knotted cloth, tap walls, and signals passed during the brief moments when cell doors aligned. What struck investigators and staff alike was not the ingenuity of the contraband itself, but the coordination it implied. Coordination between individuals in separate cells. Coordination across time. Coordination that suggested networks of influence operating below any visible surface. When contraband was confiscated, new versions appeared. When a communication method was identified and blocked, an alternative emerged. The institution was always one adaptation behind. The psychological weight on staff accumulated in ways that formal incident reports rarely captured. A write-up documents what happened. It does not document what it felt like to walk back to your car afterward. It does not document the way a sudden loud noise at home triggers a response the nervous system cannot explain to the conscious mind. Officers described carrying the unit with them in the spaces between shifts, not as dramatic flashback or breakdown, but as a persistent low hum of alertness that would not fully switch off. You stop being able to sit with your back to a room, one officer said quietly. You start clocking exits. You notice things that other people don't notice. And you can't explain it to your family. You just say work was fine, work was not fine. But the institution needed it to appear that way. And that gap between the official account and the lived reality is where the most important questions in this story begin to form. Because if officers knew this, and supervisors knew this, and the operational culture had already adapted to acknowledge the danger, then what did the institution choose to do with that knowledge? And what did it choose not to do? There is a question that follows every person who works a dangerous job long enough. Not why they took it, but why they stayed. The officers who remained assigned to that unit past their first year were not, by most accounts, reckless people. They were not adrenaline seekers, or individuals indifferent to their own safety. They were people who had made a calculation, conscious or otherwise, that leaving meant someone less prepared would take their place. That calculation cost them something. The full price became clear only later. Mentorship inside Pelican Bay's most volatile housing operated outside any official training structure. There were manuals. There were protocols. There were certification programs that officers completed before ever setting foot in the unit. None of those prepared them for what the corridor actually felt like on a Tuesday afternoon when staffing was short, and they had that particular charge to it. What prepared them was the officer walking beside them on their first rotation, the one who knew which cell to avoid making eye contact with, which door took 3 seconds longer to respond, which moments of apparent calm were the most dangerous. The training gives you the framework, a former sergeant explained. The people give you the instincts. And the instincts are what keep you alive, but mentorship is only as strong as the people delivering it. And inside a system under chronic staffing pressure, the time available for that transmission shortened. New officers were moved into rotation faster than the informal knowledge economy could absorb them. Veterans described watching junior staff make mistakes that were not failures of character or intelligence. They were failures of exposure, of time, of a system that processed bodies into positions without adequately processing people into roles. I watched a kid couldn't have been more than 6 months and walk into a situation that every experienced officer in that unit would have read differently, one former officer recalled. He didn't do anything wrong by the book, but the book didn't cover what that particular moment actually was. The incident that officer described was never formally classified as a critical event. No serious injury was recorded. No disciplinary action followed. It appeared in the department's institutional memory as nothing at all, but the officers who were present that day carried it differently. As a near miss that the paperwork did not reflect, as evidence of a gap between what the records showed and what the unit was actually producing. Those gaps accumulated quietly, without official acknowledgement. And they built something inside the staff who witnessed them, a private archive of institutional truth that diverged, incident by incident, from the public one. The officers who stayed longest developed a particular psychology that former staff described with remarkable consistency: a controlled, sustained vigilance, not paranoia of something more discipline than that. An ability to process an environment at multiple levels simultaneously while projecting absolute calm. You learn to separate your face from your nervous system, one veteran officer said. Your face says routine. Your body is always ready. And the gap between those two things is what you live in. 4 years. That gap had consequences. Relationships strained under the weight of an alertness that did not turn off at the gate. Families described living with someone who was technically present but operationally somewhere else. A husband who sat facing the door in every restaurant. A wife who startled at sounds that no one else registered. Children who learned not to approach a sleeping parent too quickly. The institution offered support structures, employee assistance programs, peer counseling referrals. Officers described those resources with a mixture of appreciation and quiet skepticism, not because they doubted the sincerity of the people delivering them, but because accessing them required an acknowledgement of difficulty that the culture made costly. In an environment where composure was both professional requirement and survival tool, admitting strain felt like exposing a vulnerability, and in a place where vulnerability was read and exploited, the instinct to conceal it ran very deep. You don't talk about it, one officer said simply. Not inside. Maybe not anywhere. The inmates inside that unit were navigating their own version of the same impossible terrain. Their survival calculus was different but structurally parallel. The internal rules of the unit demanded constant performance of toughness, of allegiance, of an indifference to fear that few actually felt. Showing weakness to the wrong person at the wrong moment carried consequences the institution could not fully monitor or prevent. Violence between inmates often went unreported. Pressures applied through the shadow economy of the unit left no visible marks. The daily reality inside those cells, the psychological weight of indefinite maximum security confinement, was documented in litigation, in court testimony, in the accounts of those who eventually spoke. But documentation and remedy are different things, and the distance between them, inside Pelican Bay's most feared unit, was very long. By the midpoint of that unit's most documented period, something had become clear to almost everyone working inside it. The system was not failing dramatically. It was failing quietly. In the staffing shortages that sent single officers into spaces designed for to. In the incident reports that captured events without capturing causes. In the gap between what training promised and what the corridor delivered. In the psychological toll that accumulated in bodies and homes and relationships, invisible to any official metric, the unit was producing damage steadily on both sides of the door, and the people most responsible for acknowledging that are the ones with the authority to change it had access to the same information that the officers did, which means the next question is the hardest one, not what happened inside that corridor, but what happened in the rooms where decisions were made about it, what was known, what was reported, and what was quietly set aside. That answer, and the documents that begin to reveal it, is where this story goes next. If this investigation matters to you, subscribe, share this with someone, and leave a comment below. What we uncover in the next chapter changes everything. There is a particular silence that institutions produce. It is not the silence of nothing happening. It is the silence of something happening and being carefully, systematically, not written down. Inside Pelican Bay's administrative structure, paperwork was not merely bureaucratic routine. It was a narrative, a version of events that the institution offered to itself and, when required, to the outside world. And like all narratives, it was shaped by what was included and what was quietly left out. Incident reports from the unit's most volatile periods followed a recognizable pattern. Events were logged, actions were documented, outcomes were recorded in the flat, procedural language that institutional writing requires. What those reports rarely captured was context, the staffing level on the day of the incident, the number of consecutive shifts the responding officer had worked, whether the warning signs that experienced staff would have recognized had been present hours before the event escalated, whether anyone had flagged those signs through available channels, and if so, what response, if any, had followed. The reports described what happened. They did not describe why it was allowed to happen. Former staff described a culture around incident reporting that was, in their accounts, quietly discouraging. Not through explicit prohibition, nothing so direct as that. Through the more subtle mechanisms that institutions use to shape behavior. Without issuing instructions, the officer who filed detailed reports about systemic concerns found those reports receiving administrative acknowledgement and little visible follow-up. The officer who documented near misses discovered that near misses existed in a classification gray area, serious enough to remember, not serious enough, apparently, to trigger formal review. Over time, the lesson was absorbed without being taught. Report the incident, describe the action, leave the system out of it. There were exceptions, officers who persisted, who submitted follow-up documentation, who requested formal reviews of specific conditions and specific patterns. Some of those requests appear in the documentary record, filed, stamped, and followed by the particular administrative silence that signals a decision has been made not to decide. Others described submitting concerns verbally, during shift briefings or supervisor meetings, and watching those concerns dissolve into the general noise of institutional management. I raised it 3 times, one former officer said. Different supervisors, different formats. The 3rd time, I was told the matter had been reviewed at the appropriate level. He paused. I never found out what that meant. I'm still not sure it meant anything. The staffing question sat at the center of almost every systemic problem officers identified. Pelican Bay, like most California correctional facilities during its peak operational years, operated under chronic staff shortages. Those shortages were documented. They were reported to relevant oversight bodies. They generated recommendations. They also continued. The practical consequence inside the unit was a recurring situation that both policy and common sense prohibited. Single officers in spaces designed for paired coverage. When that happened, it was rarely logged as a policy deviation. It was absorbed into the shift as an operational reality, managed through improvisation, and recorded, if at all, as routine. The gap between the staffing model on paper and the staffing reality on the floor was, in this way, rendered statistically invisible. Medical and psychological records from staff who eventually sought treatment told a parallel story. Diagnoses that used clinical language, adjustment disorder, hypervigilance, occupational stress response, that translated In human terms, to something simpler, people who had been asked to absorb more than the institution acknowledged, for longer than the institution admitted, without the support the institution nominally provided. Workers' compensation records from correctional facilities across California during this period documented elevated rates of stress-related claims from maximum security housing staff. Pelican Bay's figures were consistent with that pattern. What was less consistent was the institutional response, which tended toward case-by-case management rather than systemic examination. Person suffering treated as an individual event rather than a data point in a pattern. The system itself was producing. The inmate side of this accounting was documented through a different channel entirely. Litigation. Beginning in the early 1990s and continuing across subsequent decades. Legal challenges to conditions at Pelican Bay produced a body of documented testimony that the administrative record had not. Inmates described the psychological effects of prolonged isolation in language that was specific, consistent, and eventually medically corroborated. Courts received evidence. Findings were made. Orders were issued. The implementation of those orders, the pace, the completeness, the spirit in which institutional change was or was not pursued became its own contested history. What the litigation record established, beyond its specific legal findings, was this: the conditions inside that unit were not unknown to the people responsible for them. They were known. They were argued over. They were, in some instances, defended, and that defense required a narrative, a version of the unit that the institution could sustain publicly while staff and inmates sustained something different privately. Between those two versions of the official and the lived was a distance that this documentary has been tracing from its first frame, a distance measured not in physical space but in what gets written down and what does not. In what gets reported and what gets absorbed. In who is believed and whose account is treated as data rather than testimony. The documents exist. The testimonies exist. The litigation record exists. What has been harder to assemble is the connective tissue of the decisions made in rooms without cameras, by people with authority and information, that determine what the unit became and who paid the price for it. That connective tissue is what the next chapter begins to name. There is a moment that many former Pelican Bay officers describe without being asked. It arrives at different points in their accounts, sometimes early, sometimes after long pauses, but it arrives consistently. And it sounds like this: the moment they realize the job had followed them home, not metaphorically, not in the vague sense of professional stress bleeding into personal life, but concretely, physically, in the body, in the nervous system, in the architecture of daily life outside the facility. That moment, for most of them, came quietly, and that quietness made it harder, not easier, to address. The language that mental health professionals use for what these officers experienced is precise and clinical: hypervigilance, occupational trauma, chronic stress response. The language that the officers themselves used was different, simpler, more physical, more honest about what it felt like from the inside. "I couldn't sit in a room without knowing where every exit was," one former officer said, "not just noticing, needing to know, like it was a biological requirement." Another described the experience of a family dinner during which a chair scraped suddenly across a hard floor. His response, instinctive, total, and immediately obvious to everyone at the table, was something he could not explain to his children that night. He could not explain it because doing so would have required describing where it came from, and where it came from was not a place he had been able to talk about yet. The reluctance to seek help was not unique to these officers. It was structural, embedded in the professional culture of correctional work in a way that made vulnerability systematically costly. To acknowledge difficulty was to invite a reassessment of fitness, of reliability, of whether you belonged in a role that required exactly the composure you were admitting you no longer fully had. The institution offered resources. The culture made those resources difficult to access without professional consequence, real or perceived. So people managed privately, with routines, with controlled environments, with the slow, unacknowledged work of keeping a lid on something that was building pressure underneath. Some managed successfully, for years. Others did not manage as well as their personnel files. suggested, marriages fractured under the weight of things not said. Partners described living with someone who was present in every practical sense and absent in every emotional one, not cold, not unkind, simply somewhere else in the particular internal geography that the unit had created, and that did not dissolve when the uniform came off. He was always scanning, one former partner recalled. We'd be at a park with the kids and he'd be tracking movement at the perimeter. I don't think he even knew he was doing it. The children of these officers grew up with a parent shaped by an experience they could not fully share. They learned the household rules without being told them. Don't startle Dad. Don't approach from behind. Keep the noise predictable. Those rules, absorbed in childhood, left their own marks. Some officers left the job before the weight became unmanageable. They described that decision with a mixture of relief and something more complicated. A sense of having abandoned something, of having left colleagues behind in a place that still needed people who understood it. The ones who left sometimes found that civilian life required its own adjustment, a recalibration of nervous systems, tuned to a frequency that ordinary environments did not produce. Grocery stores were to open, office environments to casual. The absence of the specific danger they had trained for did not feel like safety. It felt like a different kind of disorientation. The officers who stayed until retirement carried something different, a pride in endurance that coexisted with the cost of it, a craft genuinely hard-earned, genuinely sophisticated, that had no clear application outside the institution that produced it. They had become exceptional at something the world outside the perimeter did not need and could not fully understand. That expertise, accumulated over decades, existed largely undocumented. When those officers retired, it left with them the informal knowledge that had kept the unit navigable, the passed-down instincts, the memorized layouts, the calibrated reads of atmosphere and risk, evaporated from the institutional record, leaving the next generation of officers to rediscover it through their own exposure, through their own near misses, through their own quiet recalibrations at family dinner tables. The inmates who survived long-term confinement in that unit carried their own version of this weight. Different in nature, different in origin, but structurally parallel in one important way. The experience of that place changed people on both sides of the door. It changed them in ways that the institution measured poorly, addressed inadequately, and acknowledged in its official record almost not at all. Psychological evaluations conducted on inmates after extended confinement documented effects that researchers described in terms that were stark: cognitive fragmentation, difficulties with social processing, responses to ordinary stimuli that looked, from the outside, like instability. What they were, in many documented cases, was adaptation. The mind adjusting, as minds do, to the environment it had been given. The tragedy was not that the adjustment happened. The tragedy was that the environment had been allowed to produce it. There is a question that sits underneath all of this, underneath the incident reports and the litigation, and the staffing records and the testimonies. It is not a dramatic question. It does not arrive with a revelation or a document or a moment of institutional reckoning. It arrives the way most important questions arrive: quietly, after everything else has been said. The question is this: what is an institution responsible for when it creates conditions that damage the people inside it, both the people it confines and the people it employs to do the confining? That question does not have a clean answer, but the final chapter of this story does something more important than answer it. It shows what happens when the people who lived inside that question on both sides of the door finally begin to speak. There is a particular quality to the light at Pelican Bay in the early morning, before the shifts change, before the facility finds its operational rhythm. The coastal fog sits low over the facility, and the perimeter lights cast a diffused glow that makes the concrete look almost soft. It is the closest that place comes to stillness, and in that stillness, if you listen to the people who spent years inside those walls on both sides of the door, a different kind of story emerges. Not the story of incidents and reports and administrative decisions, the story of what it costs to be human inside a system designed to suppress exactly that. The officers who agreed to speak for this documentary did so after long consideration. Some had never spoken publicly before. Some had spoken privately, to therapists or spouses or trusted colleagues, but never on record. Their decision to speak now was not made lightly. And it was not made for simple reasons. Several described a feeling that had accumulated over years of retirement or separation from the job. A sense that the official version of what that unit was, what it produced, what it cost, had been allowed to stand unchallenged for too long. "I'm not trying to burn anyone," one former sergeant said carefully. "I'm trying to make sure someone knows what it actually was. Because the people who come after deserve to know." The inmates who eventually spoke through legal proceedings, through advocacy organizations, through the slow process of reintegration, it described the unit in terms that mirrored the officers' accounts in unexpected ways. Not in their assessment of each other, not in their version of specific events, but in the underlying experience of being inside a place that operated at the edge of what human beings can sustain. Former inmate who spent 7 years in maximum security confinement at Pelican Bay described his first weeks outside the facility. The width of ordinary streets overwhelmed him. The noise of a supermarket was, for a period, genuinely disorienting. He had adapted, completely and efficiently, to an environment so controlled and so compressed that the ordinary world had become the foreign one. "I had to learn how to be in open space again," he said. "That's not a metaphor. That's literally what happened." The systemic changes that followed years of litigation and public scrutiny were real. California's use of long-term solitary confinement was significantly curtailed following a landmark settlement agreement in 2015, a result of a hunger strike involving thousands of inmates and years of sustained legal pressure. The settlement established time limits, review processes, and criteria that fundamentally altered how facilities like Pelican Bay could use isolated confinement. It was, by any measure, a significant institutional shift. Former inmates and their advocates described it as overdue by decades. Correctional administrators described navigating a changed operational landscape with resources and infrastructure that had not changed at the same pace. Both of those things can be true simultaneously. And inside Pelican Bay, both were. The officers who had worked the unit through its most unreformed years received no formal acknowledgement of what that period had cost them. No institutional recognition of the chronic understaffing that had placed them in untenable situations. No retrospective review of the incident reports that had absorbed systemic problems into individual case files. No acknowledgement of the gap between what the training promised and what the corridor delivered. What they received, in most cases, was a pension, a separation date, and the quiet understanding that the institution had moved on. "Nobody called," one retired officer said. Not with bitterness, with a kind of flat accuracy. Not when the settlement happened. Not when things changed. Nobody called to say, "You were there when it was different." And we know what that was. The question of accountability, institutional accountability, not individual, remains genuinely unresolved. Not because the evidence is absent, the litigation record, the medical documentation, the testimonies assembled here all point toward a system that knew more than it acted on, but because institutional accountability requires institutional will. And will, inside large correctional systems, tends to move in response to external pressure rather than internal conscience. The external pressure arrived, eventually, in the form of courts and hunger strikes and sustained public attention. What it produced was change, real, documented, meaningful change. What it did not produce was a reckoning with the years before the change, with the officers who navigated that corridor alone because staffing was short, with the inmates who spent years in conditions that courts would later find constitutionally problematic, with the families on both sides who absorbed the overflow of a system that had exceeded what it should have asked of anyone. There is a photograph that one former officer kept in his locker throughout his years at Pelican Bay, along our corridor, a single beam of light at the far end. He took it with him when he left. It sits, he says, in a box in a closet at his home. He does not look at it often, but he has not thrown it away. "I keep it because it was real," he said. "Because that place was real. Because what happened there to all of us, staff and inmates both, was real. And real things deserve to be remembered. Even the ones nobody wants to talk about. Pelican Bay State Prison still stands on that brittle coastline. The fog still rolls in. The perimeter lights still cast their diffused glow in the early morning. The facility is different now operationally, legally, structurally from what it was during the years this documentary has traced. But the people who were inside it during those years carry what happened with them in their bodies, in their families, in the private archives of experience that no official record fully captured. This documentary has tried to listen to those archives to give shape to what the institutional record flattened, to take seriously what the official narrative set aside. What remains after the reports and the litigation and the policy changes and the years is a human story about what we ask people to endure in the name of order. About what we owe them when the asking has gone too far. About the distance between what institutions say and what the people inside them know. That distance is not unique to Pelican Bay. It exists inside every system that processes human beings under conditions of extreme pressure. Recognizing it is not the end of the work. It is the beginning. If this investigation stayed with you, if it made you think, or remember, or look differently at something, please subscribe, share this documentary, and leave a comment below. Your engagement keeps independent investigative storytelling alive. There are more stories like this one waiting to be told, and they deserve to be heard.